Hello, this is our presentation on environmentalism by Minck, Jack Arnerich, and Kyle McLoughlin. During the 1960s and 1970s, a new environmental movement arose to prioritize cleaner air and water. This movement spurred initial government legislation on pollution. During the 1980s, the focus shifted to threats to political ecosystems created by contamination, an emphasis leading to further and more specific national legislation. More recently, in the 1990s to the 2000s, the movement has reached the international stage in pollutant regulation, particularly relating to global warming through international diplomacy. The environmental movement evolved specifically through these turning points because people increasingly wanted to combat air, water, and pollution problems and utilize different political platforms to do so. The 1960s and 1970s marked a turning point in the environmental movement because these new decades saw the beginning of the modern ecological movement focused on improving human safety in regards to air and water. In 1962, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring became the catalyst for the movement to take off. Her book addressed the pesticide DDT and its harmful effects on humans and animals, and through this piece, Carson was able to popularize her ideas about ecology, which recognized a correlationship existed between humans and the environment. In addition, membership in ecological organizations like the Wilderness Society and Sierra Club grew and gained a political foothold in Washington, D.C. These two organizations, which joined together with 8 others to form a political coalition known as the Group of 10, expanded to include professionals such as lobbyists, lawyers, and scientists. Furthermore, in 1975, catalytic converters were mandated to regulate car emissions. These converters produce carbon dioxide and water from excess oxygen and monoxide. Altogether, the American ecological movement from the 1960s and 1970s had a vast political impact. The federal government began to address environmental issues as seen in Johnson's Wilderness Act of 1964 and the creation of the EPA in 1970. A congressional legislation on clean water and air in the 1960s and heightened national pollution standards in the 1970s. Environmentalism in the 1980s underwent a shift from the more broad 1960s legislation in regards to polluted air and water to national action concerning damaged ecosystems and communities across the U.S. because small businesses and organizations started to raise awareness about the damaged ecosystems. In reaction to the increase of contamination of ecosystems, the local grassroots organizations advocated profusely for clear areas of safe environment to undergo their projects. Thus, federal and state governments were being asked by private sector companies not to construct any projects within the grassroots organization locations. These grassroots companies can be known as NIMBY organizations or Not in My Backyard organizations. These NIMBY companies raised environmental awareness throughout the country about contaminated waste sites that affected the local ecosystems, and also sparked new political organizations to help the local efforts, including the Citizens Clearing House for Hazardous Waste and the National Toxic Campaign. Besides increase of national support for ecological issues and the focus on contaminated ecosystems, the 1980s saw a massive growth of radical environmentalism. These radical groups arose in reaction to Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. These radical groups also, many citizens rebelled because of his anti-environmental stance and forced Reagan to change his views on environmental issues. Through groups like Earth First and Friends of the Earth, radical environmentalists forced out new legislation like the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1984. These political changes and new approaches to environmental issues grew largely from radical protesters and NIMBY organizations striving to protect the contaminated ecosystems. Beginning in the 1990s, environmentalism in the United States shifted to a global scale and focused on work in conjunction with other countries because the environmental issues were expanding that global political conventions became the outlook and strategy to fight for Mother Earth. Following the 1986 Chernobyl accident that affected the whole world and the realization that the ozone layer was being depleted, the United States saw a need for a global effort to protect the environment. Initially, in an effort to address concerns of international usage of the Antarctic resources for all but research, the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty was put into effect in 1991. The next year, the Earth Summit was held in Rio de Janeiro as a UN conference on worldwide environmentalism and climate change. In 1997, in an effort to advance worldwide environmentalism, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution declaring the U.S. would not sign any environmental protocol that did not include binding targets for all countries included. Under the Bush and Obama administrations, the U.S. put even more pressure on other developed and developing countries to cut their carbon emissions. By not agreeing to the Kyoto Protocol because it did not pressure developing countries enough to cut emissions, and instead applying a plan to reduce the intensity of greenhouse gases in America, the government aimed to cut worldwide as well as national greenhouse gas emissions. Recently, in 2015, the Paris Agreement was negotiated to mitigate carbon emissions as well as other greenhouse gases.